The ship slid beneath Vera's blue moon like a creature seeking shelter under a vast sleeping wing. From the observation port, Salana watched the planet bloom. A slow turning of lights and shadow, turquoise forests breathing faint phosphorescence, low banks of mist that caught the ship's landing glow and turned it into a field of glass. Her pulse kept time with the ship's descent. Scientist, cataloger, translator of firsts, and with a smaller, older rhythm that tightened in the face of something both wondrous and dangerous. Jack, near the engineering console, hands steady where hers had once been sure. They had come to Valera for reasons that read as cleanly on mission briefs and as messily in human hearts. The center wanted a catalog, a map of an energy signature that pulsed beneath the planet's crust. The report called it a guardian field. They wanted data. Salana wanted to learn what it felt like to stand in a place where the ground hummed with its own memory. Jack wanted to keep her safe in a way that had nothing to do with protocols and everything to do with a history of hands that had once fit the same spaces hers now inhabited. When the hatch blew, the world exhaled a smell like warm rain and sea glass. Valera's air was a clean ache of ions. Every inhalation felt like a question being asked of her lungs. The landing team moved with rehearsed economy. Drones that sketched topography, a rover unfurling sensors, a field tent that shimmered with its own cooling sheen. Salana's pack was light. Datapad, spectrum wand, a small leather-bound notebook she had carved into years ago. Jack's pack was heavier, weighted by a readiness she recognized and hated, an extra coil of tension in his jaw when he looked at the trees. "Keep comms open," he said. His voice was soft enough to be mistaken for technical instruction. That was Jack's way, safety draped in words that sounded like commands. "If anything diverges, call it." She nodded. They both heard the unspoken addendum. "If anything diverges, I will be there." For reasons she could not name without thudding shame, she wanted it to be true, and was prepared to test whether it would stand. The forest did not announce itself so much as unfold. Bioluminescent fronds unrolled like hands beneath a tide, casting the undergrowth in gradients of teal and violet. The flora watched like a quiet audience, their tips brightening when the rover passed, dimming again when it moved on. Between roots and stone ran an energy like a river of heat without flame, faint ridges of light along the ground, a path that registered on Salana's wand as a narrow band of harmonics. It did not behave like anything she had catalogued before. It sang in a frequency that brushed her skin and left impressions in the spaces behind her eyes. The instruments called it pattern. She called it invitation. They followed the trail until a cave mouth opened like a wound in the hillside, rimmed with fungi that pulsed in time with the planet's low hum. Cold air slipped from inside, carrying scents she tried and failed to place. Metal, flower nectar, perhaps something like memory. Jack set down the scanner and waited for her to go first. In the small, precise choreography of their partnership, those pauses had always mattered. The order of steps told a story their words never did. "Stay within range," Jack said. "Bind the tether node to the north marker." She set the tether and let the rope sing between them. The distance was both literal and symbolic. This expedition was a ladder made of scientific necessity and threaded with something that might break if they climbed unevenly. If this story is finding you, and you enjoy journeys where science and strange tenderness meet, consider subscribing. There's more to come. They moved into the cave on borrowed light. Walls held patterns like fingerprints carved in mineral, lines that glowed when the tip of Salana's wand brushed them and dimmed after as if remembering her touch. The air inside was thicker, the hum stronger. Doors of tone opened where her wand passed, and for a moment the language of the planet rearranged itself into something close to comprehension. At the heart of the cavern rose a formation of iridescent columns. Between them, a presence sat like a thought realized. Nirth did not stand as a human would. He rose with a slowness that had the weight of centuries and the curiosity of a child. His skin looked like rain on polished stone, threaded with veins of light that traveled beneath a smooth, shifting surface. Patterns ran across his arms in motifs that were not tattoos but living script. Each line pulsed with a hue different enough to be read by the instruments as complex modulation. There was a hum about him that harmonized with the cave, a frequency that suggested a mind at once alien and intimately tuned to place. Salana felt the heat of recognition before she understood why. Not because he was like her, but because the cave and the creature and the trail all fit together like parts of a language she had only just begun to learn. They tried words first and found them inadequate. Jack's voice felt foreign to the hum. His technical vocabulary hit walls that did not give and returned echoes that were not answers. Nirth responded with gestures that were neither rushed nor slow, an economy to his motion that suggested ritual. He touched a rock with a finger, and the stone bloomed with light. He extended a hand toward Salana, palm open, not in invitation so much as proposition. He would be understood if she chose to do the same. She stepped forward. Her fingers found the ridged pattern along Nirth's forearm, and the moment of contact was a thing like thunder held under thumb. A wash of warmth, a flood of images that were not sentences but impressions, geological seasons, a colony of small bioluminescent seeds splayed like stars, the steady pressure of being a guardian over centuries of waking. It was not invasive. Consent flowed through Nirth's own answering touch, a mirrored pressure that acknowledged agreement in its unfolding. The binding they felt was not a human embrace, but a joining of resonances. It pulled at the edges of their nervous systems and rearranged the space between them. Salana's breath quickened. For an instant, standing in the cave's cool heart, she felt not as a scientist alone, but as someone stitched to something beyond herself. Nirth's pattern shifted, and the color that ran along his skin matched the color of a bloom she had seen at the cave entrance, an ultraviolet that made her teeth ache with wanting to translate it into language. Jack watched from the mouth of the cave, hands on the tether rope, knuckles white. He watched how Salana's shoulders softened, how her eyes, usually trained on equipment readouts, were now unfixed, absorbing small cascades of light and meaning. He heard Nirth hum, a low, resonant chant that threaded itself under the cataloged tones of the instruments. He felt, in the marrow of his hands, a sudden and raw displacement. Where the mission's chart had once centered them both, something else was folding Salana into itself. After that first exchange, a bond opened like a second map. Salana returned to the surface each night with pockets full of samples and a head full of images. She drew Nirth's motifs in her notebook, trying to find translation where none existed yet. Each day she learned one small match in the planet's grammar, how a waste of scent indicated caution, how a slow change in color meant invitation to closer touch, how certain fungi would glow brighter if their filaments had been plucked in a particular sequence. Nirth taught using gifts. He presented a cluster of flowers that flared and dropped a dust like notes when she held them. Salana learned their pattern by ear. He scraped a sliver of stone that sang when struck and handed it like a coin. He invited her into spaces where the cave's hum sharpened into chord, and in those spaces their minds slid open to each other in passing lights. Salana answered with offerings of her own, a worn scarf tied to a column in a gesture that, in her culture, meant trust. a recording of the ship's engine humming, which made Nurth tilt his head and pulse new colors back at her. Those days made a small, private world. In it, the science remained paramount. She logged frequencies, she mapped reactions, she compiled data that would later be parsed and peer-reviewed. But intimacy threaded the work. She learned to read Nurth's silences as much as his motion. In return, Nurth learned to stand near the rover without causing a cascade of power surges, to trace his fingers along a schematic and mimic the path of an electron in a pattern that made the technical team laugh with delighted confusion. Jack's laugh stopped being the same. Initially, he observed, offering context and corrections and doing the work that kept them safe, securing the base, running checks, running tribulations of data to be sure that what they observed held up scientifically. He began with helpfulness. He always had been inclined to it, and Salana accepted those offerings without suspicion, because, habit or not, they were familiar and useful. But then the rhythm of their days shifted. Salana's bright notes were often claimed by the glow of the cave. She traveled there alone sometimes, a decision she explained in terms of minimization of contamination and maximal fidelity of observation. Nurth's presence and their exchanges were being documented, but Jack was less in the inner loop. He asked for log access and received it piecemeal. He joked about protocols. The joke wore thin. Jealousy is not a single event, but a grammar of small slights. Jack's isolation began with little omissions. He would not bring up an observation in casual conversation. He would answer Salana's jokes with a measure of distance that felt like a retraction. He started arriving later at the cave's mouth, as if some invisible rule told him that his presence would break something delicate. He watched Nurth with an appraisal that belonged more to a rival than to a fellow scientist. At whispers from other team members, jealousy seeding itself in gossip around the galley, Jack's defensiveness hardened into a strategic silence. He was professional in meetings, meticulous in reports, but his evenings were now spent in the observatory, fingers stained with coffee and eyes glued to raw feeds he did not always share. Salana noticed his absence before she interpreted its weight. She felt the vacuum of shared laughter, the missing hand that once steadied her during long sample runs. She tried to pull Jack back into the orbit of their partnership. She invited him to sit with them in the cave, to feel the hum through the tether line, to place his palm over Nurth's patterned skin. He tried once, awkward and stiff, and when he touched the guardian, the interaction was polite but shallow. The resonance brushed him and receded like a tide, leaving no footprint. He smiled with a professional's calm and then left, saying he would check the array, as if machines could fix a fissure in a heart. Jack's memories of them were a slow mirror slide into broken focus. He remembered nights on his own sofa when Salana would curl like a comet against his chest, hands tucked into his sweater, and both of them would make plans that had nothing to do with planetary surveys. He remembered the way she had once traced the scar on his palm and said it looked like map lines. Those small intimacies now seemed ancient, catalogued and preserved instead of lived. The cave had stolen immediacy from him, replacing it with suspicion. And suspicion grew worse when he found anomalies in the data archives, minor edits that shifted timestamps, little deletions in daily logs that made sequences look cleaner than they had been. Whoever did them had an eye for the story they wanted recorded. He told himself he was being meticulous. He told himself that the mission's integrity required his vigilance. But inside, something colder and less reasoned hummed. The fear that Salana's allegiance was migrating to the luminous creature with a guardian's patience. That fear birthed the plans. Small at first. Reroute cameras to focus on perimeters rather than the cave's core. Adjust the sensitivity of certain recorders to prioritize quantitative over qualitative data. Backup logs under a password only he maintained. Each act was plausible, useful even. and he performed them in the neutral language of operations. Each act also moved him, step by step, into a space where he held secrets from the woman he had loved. On the fourth day, Salana and Nurth performed a ritual beneath an arch of fungus that burned a slow heat against the cave's stone. Nurth had placed a ring of petals on the ground. The flower's centers pulsed with an inner light, and offered them to Salana. She sat in the center, and the way he lighted the petals felt like an offering in a culture that had never had words for ownership. Nurth did not gesture possessively. Instead, he created a circle that allowed the two of them to share a private field. Salana closed her eyes. She was honest with herself. This was more than curiosity. There was a longing that braided with the scientific thrill, a need to feel connected to something that had not been categorized yet. It scared her because it felt like uncharted territory for a scientist who had always believed that emotion was a variable to be acknowledged but not allowed to skew outcomes. She felt Nurth lean close, and his skin warmed more where it hummed against her wrist. The pattern along his forearm multiplied its pulses until the whole cave was a soft staccato. He let his hand hover an inch from her chest, not touching, but close enough for heat to move across their skin. It was a gesture of invitation and of offering a world without language, but with reciprocal intention. "I want to feel you deep inside," she whispered. The words were small and terrible and entirely true. She said them not as a plea of possession, but as an entreaty to connect at the deepest possible level, to know Nurth's mind as it had felt the landscape for centuries, to let her own internal topographies be read and answered. When sound left her, it was not only hers. Even the cave seemed to bend toward the phrase and hold it. Nurth's reply was not a sentence, but a modulation, a weaving of colors and hums that traced the same rhythm as her heartbeat. He shifted, and the pattern of his skin mirrored the phrase back to her in light. Where she had said inside, his colors pulsed deeper, a violet like the underside of a storm cloud. He curved a finger, a slow covenant, and let the hum touch the center of her chest. In that instant, the cave and the creature and the human in its center conspired into an intimacy that was not an act but a binding. She felt the outline of his perception fold against hers, like two maps superimposed, some lines aligning, others revealing new territories. It was consensual. Nurth had welcomed the intimacy with gestures of invitation. Salana had chosen it, closing her eyes and stepping into it. The feeling was of resonance, vibration syncing, a warmth that was equal parts biochemical and ineffable. She did not lose herself. Instead, she found the contours of her own needs reflected and answered. Outside, a monitor in the observatory hummed. Jack had been there, under the pretense of calibrating sensors. He had told himself he was conducting a routine check, making sure their instruments captured raw, unedited data. But what he saw on the screen wasn't just a graph. It was Salana's voice feathered into light, the way Nurth's skin responded, the rise and fall of harmonics that suggested a depth of sharing deeper than mere curiosity. A line of data showed an alignment between two frequency signatures that had not matched before, a pairing that would be filed as landmark discovery by the center and would alter every ethical and practical discussion about guardianship, sentience, and diplomatic protocol. Jack watched the graph climb and then knit into a pattern that, when he stared at it, felt like a betrayal rather than a breakthrough. The rational part of him, the mission officer, saw an unprecedented interface between species and understood that this was material of the highest order. The jealous part of him recognized Salana's name tied to it and saw how easily her name would be credited by a world that prized the first human to bridge worlds. His hands, alone in the cool observatory, found a tool and held it until the metal warmed. He told himself not to move hastily. He told himself he would preserve the mission. He told himself he would not let personal feelings compromise the safety of the team or the objectivity of their work. But the instrument he took was one that could nudge decisions into being. A surgical recalibration device used to tighten beams, to shift power outputs, to direct the rover's uplink. In his pocket, he folded permission letters, administrative papers he had the authority to sign in an emergency. The plan that formed in him was small, precise, and hideable. It would not end in violence tonight. It might begin as data control. It might be a simple reroute of relay signals, a perturbation subtle enough to force Salana to return to the ship. Or it might be something that fed the press release in the manner he believed would force Salana to choose between the career-defining discovery she was becoming and the safety between them that had once been their refuge. For all his calculation, the decision that settled in Jack's chest was not a clinical one. It was a line of resentment that had thickened into resolve. He saw the pattern on the monitor reflect back the tender tilt of Salana's face, and he imagined, with a clarity that chilled him, reporters' voices, colleagues' congratulations, future conference stages where she would speak of bridging and guardians and the human heart. He imagined her name attached to discoveries and felt his own memory of her being erased. The mission's ethics could be a shield for whatever he chose to do. He would frame the actions as protecting a fragile diplomatic order. He left the observatory with the device tucked beneath his jacket, and his steps were steady. His outward composure masked a sense of inevitability. He had convinced himself he could tilt the scale without shattering it. In that fragile fantasy, he was still the man who would rescue rather than the man who would destroy. Inside the cave, the exchange finished not as a consummation, but as a promise. Nurth's hand drifted from her chest, and the cord of light between them dimmed to a comfortable glow. He placed both hands over hers, and for a long while they sat, palms touching palms, sharing breath and quiet knowledge. Salana felt a contentment that was both scientific and sacramental. She had anchored a new language, a new contact that would ripple outward and reframe the mission. She had chosen it. And in choosing it, she had also stepped into a most perilous human landscape, the one where love and discovery are tangled, where curiosity can break a person or make them new. When they surfaced, the planet held its breath in a tangle of vines and shimmering sky. The night smelled like the inside of a bell. Jack stood near the ship with the tool still warm in his hand, his face an unreadable mask. Salana emerged, carrying a vial of dust that glittered like stars. She smiled when she saw him, the way she always had when bridging two disparate things, reality and possibility. His answer was a nod that did not reach his eyes. "You okay?" she asked. He hesitated, then said the one thing both true and insufficient. "Fine, I'll log the data." He meant it in the way a man might say he would water a plant while planning to transplant it. In the days that followed, the mission continued to unspool. Data arrived that would reframe human understanding of sentience. Nurth's presence became a subject of cautious wonder. The center sent remote analysts, their messages clipped and full of protocol. Salana documented every modulation, every ritual, every gift. She recorded Nurth's names for the seasons and offered, in return, names of her own. Names that simplified without erasing the depth of what she was learning. Jack did his work with a surgeon's focus. He corrected anomalies on archived feeds, he smoothed out scheduling so he could be present at the edges. He adjusted a parameter here, a delay there, small edits, plausible and defensible. He told himself that in protecting the mission, he was protecting the thing he had loved. But hidden in his changes were seeds of something else. Credits misfiled, timestamps shifted, privileges reserved for emergencies that allowed him to control who saw what and when. Each tweak was justified by professional caution. Each tweak quietly reassembled possibility into a shape he could supervise. The crew's sleep pattern grew ragged, the air thick with the weight of choices. In the lab, Salana ran a file and found a line of raw footage missing. She frowned and tapped to recover it, but the archive returned only a clipped version that left a gap where a long, luminous discussion had occurred. She took the omission to Jack in the technical room, and he told her to trust the backups. That night, in the privacy of the galley, she pressed him on it, and he said, "We have to protect it." She left unsatisfied but trusting. There was a small ache in her chest she would not maim then, resilience and sorrow interlaced. On the penultimate night before their scheduled uplink to the center, Salana returned alone to the cavern where Nurth waited like a patient sculpted into skin and light. The petals were arranged in a new pattern at their feet. Nurth's gaze was a study of small things. He moved his fingers, and the cave's columns answered with a hush that seemed to say the planet was listening. Salana sat and placed her hand over the ring of flowers. "We have to be careful," she told Nurth, in the halting, silly sentences that were all she could manage when explaining human politics across an alien gap. "People will want to file you into their stories. I don't want to be the one to put you on a shelf." Nurth's response was a slow pulsing of colors that matched the cadence of sigh. He bent and pressed a petal to her lips, a gesture of trust that translated to both affection and a covenant to guard the other's essence. In that small ceremony, she felt something like home. She thought of Jack, of the way his mouth tightened in the dark, of the device he had hidden beneath his jacket. She thought of the words she had whispered, and of how fragile a thing language was when called upon to hold two species between its teeth. Above ground, the blue moon was a thin coin in the sky. Beneath it, Jack moved with the deliberate steps of claim. He had made his choice, and it had the clarity of someone who had only come to the frontier of himself at last. His action would not be a single clumsy blow, but a series of well-placed shifts. He would not tear the bridge down tonight. He would reroute the flow, tighten the stream until Salana noticed the dam and chose. Or he would bring to the surface a problem so urgent the center itself would call them home, and with them would go the fragile new bridge between human and guardian. He thought of the center's response, of the debates and committees, and felt a grim satisfaction at the idea that the politics of safety might force Salana to stand on one side or the other. His breath formed small clouds in the cool air as he made his way to the comms. He keyed a transmission that spoke of anomalies, a plausible alarm that would require re-evaluation. He told himself it was for the greater good. He told himself there might be a chance to reclaim what had been his without burning the world they all stood upon. Salana and Nurth remained in the cave, their hands folded over one another's, an island of mutual recognition. The colors around them slowed, a lullaby of signal and response. Even happiness on Valera had the exactness of ritual. They had discovered something true, an intimacy of minds, a contact that would ripple outward, and in that truth lay the seeds of the next storm. When Salana finally rose to leave, the cave's columns dimmed like a congregation calling it a night. She turned to Nurth, and for a moment the wildness of the planet and the intimacy they had cultivated seemed to hang over them like a promise. "There's so much to record," she said into the quiet, and it was both a professional assessment and a vow. Nerth answered by touching the place where her hand had traced the scar on his own wrist, a gesture that held memory. He pulsed a softly modulated sequence that, more than any words, said, "Stay." She stepped into the passage and felt the tether tug, a reminder of the world beyond the cave. The cavern exhaled. The planet's hum receded to its steady base. Outside, Jack stood where the path opened, hands empty, face unreadable. His jaw was a hard line. He had made his decision. Salana met his gaze, and in that instant understood that they stood at a hinge. She could see the shapes of what might come, a verification hearing, a public debate, possibly a rupture she could not predict. She also saw the more intimate possibility, a betrayal that could be something small enough to be framed as protocol and large enough to alter the bridge they had labored to build. "What did you do?" she asked, without venom, because the science in her demanded the question before the accusation. Jack looked away, as if the deception had already gnawed a notch in his resolve. "I adjusted the uplink. There's an anomaly in the relay that needs center attention." "It better not be," she began, then stopped. The cave had taught her modesty in pronouncement. It had taught her that naming a thing changed it. Instead, she asked more softly, "Why?" He swallowed. "Because I think we need to be careful," he said, and the sentence contained many truths. Care, fear, an older man's need to be remembered. But care folded here into control. The two of them stood under the blue moon, and the planet around them waited to see which would be the louder force, devotion to discovery or devotion to possession. In the next hours, mundane things would happen. Messages would be sent, arguments would be made, teams would convene. But in that charged instant under Vera's watch, a line had been crossed.